Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for your patience as we got this going. Micah might be joining us back here in a few minutes. Want to start out this presentation regarding the Smart Freight Center and MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, Sustainable Aviation Fuel Insetting and Accounting Guidelines with just a little bit of housekeeping. One, the first item, never trust GoToWebinar, even if you do 6 or 7 trial runs, because when you go live, you might have some issues. And GoToWebinar people who might be on the webinar, not hating on you, just it was a rocky start this morning. As for webinar content, the webinar I do believe is being recorded, and we will share a link to the webinar recording in the slides with all of the registrants at the conclusion or after the webinar. It might be a couple of days after. Also, we'd like to ask that any questions you have during the course of the webinar, you submit using the questions function in GoToWebinar rather than the chat function. There's just a few of us here today, and we're only going to have the capability to monitor the questions function for questions rather than the chat function. All right, with that housekeeping out of the way, a brief introduction to Smart Freight Center and the Center for Transportation and Logistics. SFC, as some of you may know, is a small nonprofit organization based in Amsterdam, and we focus specifically on reducing and helping organizations to reduce emissions in their freight transportation supply chains. We had the opportunity to partner with MIT, that's Massachusetts Institute of Technology Center for Transportation and Logistics, on this project. And MIT, not unlike SFC, has quite a bit of credentials in this space and has been working actually for longer than SFC has been around with organizations to help them, I'll say, be more efficient across their logistics and transportation supply chains. A little bit about the presenters today. We'll be starting after I get going here with Kellen Betts. He's a project manager at MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Also, we're honored to have Alan Lewis, who's the Technical Development Director at Smart Freight Center, joining us here today. He'll be taking over more towards the end of the presentation once we shift into the question and answer section, and we'll be moderating that work. Also, Micah is a program coordinator with us at Smart Freight Center. Hopefully she'll be joining us soon and will actually take over some of the facilitation of the meeting that I'm filling in on right now. And then there's, of course, myself. My name's Dan Smith. I'm a senior technical manager at Smart Freight Center and was the SFC lead for this project, working with Kellen and his colleagues at MIT on developing these insetting guidelines.
Dan, can I
see you're back. Are you perfect? You're back with audio. So now I'm going to turn you over to Micah's capable hands, and she'll pick up where I left off there. Thank you, Micah.
Thank you, Dan, for picking up for me. It's a classic error that tends to show up when the timing's not right, but my audio is working right now. So let's move on to the topic of today. As some of you might be aware of, Smart Freight Center and CTL have recently established guidelines that focus on greenhouse gas emissions accounting and insetting with sustainable aviation fuels. The purpose of these guidelines is to promote more sustainable aviation for both freight and passenger transportation. The guidelines, they help to facilitate the production and distribution of aviation fuels with lower greenhouse gas emissions than conventional aviation fuels. And yeah, with this, we hope to pave the way for a more sustainable aviation sector. So before I give the floor to Kellen, we want to do a quick poll because we are curious with what interest you are joining this webinar. So I'm going to pull up a poll. And our question in this is your interest in the webinar principally related to emissions from freight transportation or from passenger transportation? And I'll give you guys a second to answer this. So you can choose for either freight or passenger emissions, both, or it might be not sure. I'm gonna wait a little bit longer for everyone to submit. Okay, so about half of you are interested in passenger emissions. So this is the most interested part. And then many of you are also interested in both passenger and freight. And then we have about 20% that is interested in freight emissions. So thank you. This is really interesting, interesting to see, and we hope you, you gather some knowledge with this webinar. So yeah, Kellen, I want to give the floor to you.
Great, thank you, Micah. Can you just to confirm? Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay, I'll get started. So thank you, Micah, again, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Kellen Betts. I'm a project manager at the Center for Transportation and Logistics at MIT. We wanted to start by setting the stage with a little background on the aviation industry and sustainable aviation fuel before launching into the details of insetting and accounting. So aviation is a young industry, maybe not the youngest. We now have space tourism as a few weeks ago, but powered flight only got started in the early 20th century with that famous first flight by the Wright brothers in 1903. One of the first demonstration flights for air cargo, for those who are interested in cargo or freight, was held 7 years later. At that time, cargo meant mail, and that flight in 1910 pitted a plane against a locomotive. The oldest airline that's still around today is KLM, founded in 1919. And the ability to move cargo was transformed in the late 1960s with the introduction of the 747 wide-body aircraft, which allowed the movement of palletized cargo rather than individual packages. Today, the industry moves over 4.5 billion passengers each year and almost 1 billion tons of cargo. Now, due to the basic physics of flight, aircraft might not be able to move large and heavy cargo like ships and trains. So the industry only moves 1% of global cargo by physical dimensions. However, the industry does move some of the most valuable cargo, and so by value, aviation moves roughly 35% of global cargo. And these numbers are from 2019, pre-pandemic intentionally. The COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on the industry. We won't try to predict what the near-term outcome will be for the purposes of this webinar. Prior to the pandemic, the industry was growing roughly 2% per year, and despite the challenges presented by the pandemic, the industry is still an essential part of global movement of both passengers and cargo. And so with that, let's review what aviation supply chains look like a little more closely. And so next slide, please. Great. So the aviation industry is complex, and there are many different parties involved in air travel of both passengers and cargo. For the purposes of this project, we focus on the supply chain with 4 key parties. This basic supply chain structure will be important as we dive into the detail of carbon insetting and accounting. So for the passenger supply chain, which is this slide here, our focus is on the business travel, which is represented by that light blue tile on the right-hand side. Now, business travelers can work with travel management companies or TMCs who facilitate the purchase of transportation services. And then transportation services are provided by air carriers, who are the companies that own and operate aircraft. And those aircraft are powered by, of course, fuel, and that is purchased from fuel suppliers. So that's a simplified passenger supply chain we will focus on today. Next slide, please. So there's a very similar supply chain for freight. The slides essentially look identical. The primary difference is that instead of a business traveler, you have a company that owns cargo, and then the logistics providers who help coordinate those freight movements. In some cases, the airlines are the same as those who move passengers with cargo carried in the belly of the aircraft. There are also airlines and aircraft dedicated specifically to moving freight. And all those aircraft, of course, use fuel. And again, these are the basic supply chains that we will focus on in this webinar and our guidelines for carbon insetting and accounting. And so with that, let's dive into why we are focused on aviation, sustainable aviation fuel with the next slide, please. Great. Okay, so why are we here today? We want to talk about aviation and sustainable aviation fuel, but the real reason is the impact aviation has on the environment, specifically climate change. Globally, aviation accounts for roughly 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, 3% might not sound like a lot, but it's a larger share than the entire country of Germany. It's also roughly the same share as maritime shipping with those massive ships. And similar to maritime shipping, it's extremely hard to abate emissions from. Excuse me there. And narrowing our scope to those aviation supply chains from business travel and air freight that we just discussed, aviation is also a significant source of emissions for the companies engaged in those supply chains. And again, aviation is a hard industry to abate emissions from. Other than demand management, aircraft, and operational efficiency, the only solution available today to reduce the emissions intensity of aviation is sustainable aviation fuel, or what we'll refer to as SAF very frequently. That does not mean that there are not other technologies and strategies at various stages of research and development. So for example, electric aircraft with a battery energy store. And we need and we support those other pathways. However, the solution available today is SAF, and that will be our focus. In fact, SAF is not just available today. The first sustainable aviation fuels were certified for commercial use over a decade ago, with over 200,000 flights powered by SAF so far. However, those 200,000 flights are only a small slice of the roughly 30 million flights that occurred each year over that decade, meaning that the contribution of SAF, and a blended SAF as it is, so far is roughly 200,000 of maybe 300 to 400 million flights. So here's the opportunity. Aviation contributes 3% of global emissions. It's a significant source of emissions for companies and corporations who are looking for ways to reduce those emissions, and sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is a key solution. So with that, next slide, please. Okay, so if SAF's a key solution, let's dive in a little to what SAF actually is and emissions characteristics or environmental benefits of using it. So one of the most important characteristics of SAF is it's a drop-in replacement when mixed with conventional aviation fuel. This drop-in characteristic means we can use existing aircraft and fueling infrastructure. We don't need to retrofit or replace the aircraft fleet, and we can use the existing fuel supply systems to deliver SAF to aircraft once it's made. However, unlike conventional aviation fuel, which is made from fossil oil, SAF is made mostly from biomass, or what we call biogenic feedstocks. Common examples of this include municipal waste, used cooking oils and other plant oils, waste gases, agricultural residues, and forestry residues. Now, there are other feedstocks and ways to make SAF as well. This list is not meant to be comprehensive. For the purpose of this webinar and the guidelines we publish, we focus on the biogenic feedstocks because it's what material quantities of SAF are actually made from today. That said, the accounting rules, tools, and concepts will also work for other types of SAF as they become available. And there are many different production technologies and pathways to make SAF, both from these biogenic feedstocks as well as from other pathways like power to liquid. I won't go into the details of these different technologies and pathways. However, I do want to note that the difference in feedstocks and pathways has a number of important considerations, such as their feasibility and scalability, their production costs, as well as the environmental attributes of the fuel. And that's one point I do want to discuss a little further with the next slide, please. Okay, so one characteristic I do want to dive into further is the environmental attributes of SAF. Since SAF is made from biomass, and again, we'll focus on that specific pathway today. So since it's made from biomass, or what we call biogenic SAF, it contains carbon that was recently removed from the atmosphere. One way to think about that is SAF is made from plants. Basic plant biology shows that plants use CO2 from the atmosphere in photosynthesis, and in doing so, they remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, this has a ton of important implications, and it's why forests are such a critical part of climate change mitigation. Some call the forest the lungs of our atmosphere, taking in CO2, breathing out oxygen. In the case of aviation fuel, however, it means that CO2 released when combusted in the engine, that CO2 is cycled through the atmosphere. Another way to say that is SAF, or specifically biogenic SAF, is part of a carbon cycle. Now, this is fundamentally different than conventional aviation fuel made from fossil oil. Fossil oil is extracted from the ground. While it's ultimately made from plants and organic matter as well, the geologic time scale that made fossil oil is way longer than the span of time that CO2 actually stays in the atmosphere, where it has a global warming effect. So what that means is that fossil-based aviation fuel is not part of a current carbon cycle. And that distinction between conventional fuel and SAF is important. When we compare them like this, we're comparing their life cycle footprint, not just the emissions from combustion in the engine, but the full life cycle of the fuel. And the net result of comparing conventional fuel with SAF is a lower life cycle footprint for SAF. There is less CO2 that stays in the atmosphere on a life cycle basis with SAF compared to conventional aviation fuel. And I want to note that this carbon cycle with biogenic SAF is not perfect. There's still a net increase in CO2, and the effectiveness of that loop, meaning how much goes through the cycle, how well it can close the loop, is based on the feedstock that is used and the production processes that make a specific type of SAF. This means that different SAF feedstocks and pathways have different impacts on the climate based on how much better they are at cycling carbon through the atmosphere compared to conventional fuel. And that's the key point I want to make. We need to measure the life cycle emissions benefit, if you will, of a specific type of SAF compared to conventional aviation fuel. And that life cycle difference, again, we also call this a benefit, is what we are referring to here as the environmental attribute of SAF. There are potentially other environmental attributes of SAF. The one we focus on here for carbon insetting accounting is the life cycle CO2 equivalent emissions when using SAF compared to conventional fuel. Okay, so that slide's definitely a mouthful, but it's important to understand when we're talking about SAF and why it's worth investing in the production and use of SAF. And so with that, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so if SAF's available today, it's a solution to reduce emissions in aviation today. Why aren't all planes flying with SAF today? And in fact, very few planes are actually flying with SAF today. Today, less than 0.1% of the fuel in aviation is SAF. So I'll repeat that number for emphasis, less than 0.1%, a tiny fraction of the fuel used by aircraft today is SAF. And that's with over a decade of availability. The rest, some 99.9%, is basically conventional aviation fuel made from fossil oil. Now, that's unfortunate, but there are really important reasons why little SAF is used today. First, even if there are companies willing to invest in producing and using SAF, there's a lack of clear accounting guidelines that show how they can account for the benefits of that investment. There are broad guidelines for corporate carbon accounting, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and many others. There are also more specific guidelines for logistics, like the GLEC framework. However, the aviation industry is complex and SAF is complex. Each different feedstock and production pathway can have a different net benefit. In the guidelines we publish, we include detail for 21 different combinations of feedstock and pathway, and there are others as well. And what this means is that even if the parties in the aviation supply chains are willing and able to invest in SAF, how they can account for the benefits of that investment across the supply chain is not a level of detail that's found in current carbon accounting guidelines. And accounting for the benefit of SAF is important because the investment needed to scale production and use SAF is significant, and it comes with significant risk. So for example, according to one analysis, we'll need 170 new biorefineries costing tens of billions of dollars per year to meet the production demands for SAF by 2050. Now, tens of billions sounds like a lot, and of course it is. You're certainly not going to find that in my bank account. However, it's important to put that number into context because it's not an unreachable investment goal. In fact, the oil industry currently invests roughly $60 billion per year for conventional fuels, and so the investment needed for SAF is roughly on par with the current investment levels for conventional fuels. However, investing in SAF means investing in a new technology, which comes with significant risk. And a lot of that risk is due to the large cost premium with SAF. At the current scale of production, compared to conventional fuel, again, that 0.1%, a tiny fraction, SAF just costs a lot more than conventional fuel. That cost comes from both the investment in new biorefineries, or perhaps the conversion or modification of existing ones. It also comes from the expensive feedstocks used to make it. And so for airlines, those who are purchasing that fuel, where fuel costs can be 20 to 30% of operating costs, a significant premium on top of that existing operating costs means that demand is just way lower than where we need it to be to address greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation industry. And so these are the opportunities and challenges with SAF that we take on in these guidelines. With that, I'll pass the stage to Dan, who will dive into the specific solutions we propose for these challenges. So Dan, take it away.
Great, thanks much, Kellen. Mike, are you willing to jump us to the next slide? Perfect. So as Kellen just mentioned, a key challenge really for the uptake of SAF is this cost premium of SAF as compared to conventional aviation fuels. If we consider that SAF costs are running anywhere from 2 in a subsidized market to maybe 5 or 6 times the cost of conventional aviation fuels, and as Kellen just noted, with fuel being one of the key a principal variable cost for air transportation service providers, the carriers. Even carriers, if they wanted to use a lot of sustainable aviation fuel, they just could not do so and remain competitive in the air transportation market. Now, one way to address this challenge is to take that cost premium of SAF and spread it across an air transportation supply chain. So if the cost premium is spread across the whole supply chain, then no single entity or group of entities in the air transportation supply chain has to bear the entire cost premium of SAF. And if we make the cost premium of SAF lower for individual entities or groups of entities in an air transportation supply chain by spreading it around, our thinking is that the likelihood that entities in an air transportation supply chain will be able to purchase SAF is going to increase, and that'll lead to the increased uptake of SAF. So to use a real simple analogy, I've got this cake here shown on the slide. If we consider the cost premium of SAF to be this cartoon cake here, it's the wedding cake that we've all experienced at a wedding sometime in our lives. It's that nasty, dry coconut wedding cake. Even the frosting is no good. It is too much cake for the air carriers to eat. If we take the nasty cake and we slice it up and spread it along other entities in the air transportation supply chain, then it's going to be more stomachable for every entity in the air transportation supply chain. So the idea is we're taking the nasty cake and we're spreading it around so that everybody gets a little bit of gastrointestinal distress instead of just no cake getting eaten. Next slide, please, if we may, Micah. Okay, so how do we spread that cake? How do we spread the cost premium of SAF across the air transportation supply chain? What we propose in our guidelines is insetting as a mechanism to do that. Air transportation insets, I'm going to define here as interventions that an organization makes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions outside of their direct emissions footprint, outside of their purchased electricity footprint, but inside of the air transportation sector. And this last characteristic of an inset inside the air transportation sector is key because it's really what distinguishes an inset from an offset. And I'm assuming that most of the people on the call have heard about offsets. Forestry projects are a common example. An organization that's outside of the forestry sector compensates for their greenhouse gas emissions by paying for someone to either plant trees or to not cut down trees. The inset is different from the offset because it involves a contribution towards reducing emissions from the activities rather that are actually causing the emissions. So I love trees. Planting trees it may be great, and at the same time, planting a tree does not necessarily do anything to address the source of air transportation emissions. And that's what's key about insetting with SAF. SAF insets do address the source of air transportation emissions. So to sum up these two concepts, the cake and the inset, first, we're acknowledging that carriers alone cannot bear the cost premium of SAF. And that's been borne out by, as Kellen noted, SAF's been around for quite some time, and it's still just a fraction of percent of the volume of aviation fuel used in a given year. And then second, we're proposing that the cost premium of SAF can be spread across the air transportation supply chains by the means of this mechanism that we're calling insets with SAF. Next slide, please, Micah. Okay, so insetting is a tool for spreading the cost premium of SAF across an air transportation supply chain. But if we're going to spread that cost premium of SAF, the cost premium needs to be associated with something. There has to be some item that we're assigning the cost premium to. Even the most benefactor of a business traveler or a freight shipper isn't just going to say, I'm going to pay more for SAF. That freight shipper or business traveler needs to know what they're paying more for and how much that they're buying. So with SAF, the thing that's being purchased or transacted rather is the emissions reductions benefits associated with the discrete volume of fuel as reflected in the emissions intensity of that discrete volume of fuel. Now, Kellen mentioned in a little bit of detail that there are many different feedstocks and production processes for sustainable aviation fuel. And he also noted that the emissions intensity of SAF varies by the feedstock and the production process. This means there's not an emissions intensity for SAF just in general. That also means that a fuel producer is going to have to establish the environmental attributes of SAF, including its emissions intensity for a particular batch of SAF or a particular production process at a particular facility using a particular feedstock. So whatever that emissions intensity is that we get from the fuel producer, it needs to be tracked from the producer to the entity that is purchasing the emissions reductions benefits of SAF. Like I said a minute ago, a shipper, a logistics service provider, a business traveler is, if they're going to pay for the emissions reductions benefits of SAF, they need to know what emissions reductions benefits they're purchasing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so chain of custody systems are one way to track the emissions reductions benefits or the emissions intensity really of a discrete volume of SAF across an air transportation supply chain. Now, when we were developing the guidelines, we researched several chain of custody systems for tracking environmental attributes. I'm not going to go into the details of each of them here, but I'll jump to the point, which is we're recommending that a chain of custody system called a book and claim chain of custody system is the most practicable chain of custody system for tracking the environmental attributes of sustainable aviation fuel in air transportation supply chains. And you can see here on the slide kind of a coarse depiction of a chain of custody, book and claim rather, chain of custody system. And as you can see in the slide, in a book and claim chain of custody system, both the physical and virtual environmental attributes of a parcel or a discrete volume really of SAF are separated from the physical molecules. So the diagram shows that the physical sustainable aviation fuel itself goes from the little cartoon SAF refinery into the conventional aviation fuel distribution system. The sustainable aviation fuel molecules themselves are indistinguishable from conventional aviation fuel at that point. And once they're commingled with conventional aviation fuel in the existing fuel distribution system, the SAF molecules are no longer tracked or accounted for or treated any differently than conventional aviation fuel. At the same time, the environmental attributes of that SAF are separated from the physical fuel molecules, and those environmental attributes, principally for our concerns, the emissions intensity of that discrete volume of SAF, can be tracked separately and are tracked separately for these SAF environmental attribute transactions. Now, I'm going to harp on this a little bit because one reason that this physical and virtual separation of the environmental attributes from SAF molecules is so important is that it provides access to SAF environmental attributes to entities in an air transportation supply chain who might not have access to the physical SAF supply. So if you're a business traveler who's flying out of, I'm just going to pick an airport in the US, say out of Salt Lake City, and there's not a physical supply of sustainable aviation fuel, not SAF production capacity servicing the Salt Lake City airport, under this book and claim chain of custody system, you aren't barred from accessing SAF environmental attributes. Another point that I want to speak to around this book and claim chain of custody system is that the physical and virtual separation of the SAF environmental attributes from the SAF fuel molecules mean that you as a business traveler or as a freight shipper may be traveling on an aircraft or shipping your cargo on an aircraft that is not actually propelled by SAF molecules, even if you purchase SAF environmental attributes. So we're going to dance around those concepts a little bit later in the presentation, but those are some key points about the book and claim chain of custody system to keep in mind as we move into a deeper discussion of insetting. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Thank you. So I've described this book and claim chain of custody system for tracking environmental attributes. It's a wonderful concept. It provides us that all-important flexibility that we need for different entities in an air transportation supply chain to purchase the emissions reductions benefits of SAF, even if they don't physically touch the SAF. That flexibility is really important, but we also want to make sure that all relevant entities in an air transportation supply chain are still going to be confident that the SAF emissions reductions that they're buying are first of a legitimate origin, that they're also of a reasonable vintage, and also importantly that they're not erroneously double counted. So to meet those needs, we've got to put some kind of guardrails on this theoretical academic book and claim chain of custody system, just to maintain the integrity of SAF environmental attribute transactions that might occur. Now, I also want to remind everyone that when I was defining an air transportation inset a few minutes ago, I said that the air transportation inset is defined in many ways by the fact that it's inside the air transportation sector. That is, it's an emissions reduction intervention focused inside the air transportation sector. So we need to define here with these guardrails on our book and claim chain of custody system what exactly it means to be inside the air transportation sector rather for a particular organization. And this question of what classifies as inside the air transportation sector, what's outside the air transportation sector for a specific organization was the topic of much deliberation and debate as we developed the guidelines. We went back and forth on this literally for months. We solicited input from stakeholders across air transportation supply chains. We engaged with prominent environmental NGOs that have a role in this space. We talked to the forwarder community. We talked to the shipper community. We talked to the business travel community, and also carriers or representatives rather from the carrier segment. Outside of all that deliberation, we ultimately decided that for a SAF intervention to be an inset, it had to be bound by air transportation activity. And what I mean when I say air transportation activity is defined specifically and numerically in the guidelines document itself. And we also explain how to calculate it in the guidelines. At a real high level for this presentation though, we're effectively saying that you can't overbuy SAF environmental attributes when you inset. An organization can inset SAF up to the volume of SAF or the volume of aviation fuel rather that they use during a reporting period. So that's the transportation activity boundary on the book and claim chain of custody system. Also, we established a vintage boundary on the book and claim chain of custody system, and effectively the vintage boundary just maintains a temporal connection between the time when SAF was produced and when the emissions reductions benefits of that SAF are reported or accounted for. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's insetting as it applies to SAF environmental attributes, and a general introduction and overview of the book and claim chain of custody system. We're going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the nuts and bolts of greenhouse gas emissions accounting for SAF. But before we make that jump, Mike, are you willing to bring up the second poll question where we're going to ping our attendees to get a feel for how they track and account for their air transportation emissions?
Yes, I'm pulling it up right now.
Thanks. So really, this is a pretty simple question. We're asking if you track your air transportation emissions, and if so, how you report on those emissions. And we'll give a few seconds here. That's actually not true. We'll give you more than a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds or so, for you guys to respond to this question. Okay, let's see here. We've got 64% of people voted. Can we get it up to 80? 68, it's climbing, it's climbing. We just need 12%. Come on, 12. 69, this is painful. 70, we're looking good. 71, 9% and counting. 72, you're killing me. 73, 4, 5 more percent. That's all we need. Just a few more, well, who knows how many more people. 76, almost there. 2 more percent. 80%. Okay, we can close the poll. That was a little bit intense, at least for me. So 80% of you responded, which is fantastic. Thank you for that. And 17% of those 80% say that you track your transportation emissions, but you don't report them. 46%, that's encouraging, track and report them. 14 don't track, and then a fair amount are not sure. Okay, so that's helpful input in those 46%, or actually 46% of trackers and reporters, and the 17% of reporters then will have a little leg up maybe on some of the others, because the concepts we're going to talk about now for emissions accounting are all about that. So just a little bit of refresher. One of the principal aims of the guidelines is to scale the production and use of SAF. And we were proposing to do that. Oh, can you jump back, Micah, one slide back? So we're proposing, thank you. We're proposing to scale the production and use of SAF by helping spread the cost premium of SAF across the air transportation supply chains, the infamous cake slide. And we've discussed how the cost premium of SAF needs to be associated with something. We've explained how that thing for SAF is the emissions reductions benefits or the emissions intensity of SAF. So the accounting information in the guidelines, and the reason that we devote so much content to accounting, one reason, is that the guidelines explain how to track that thing, the emissions reductions benefits of SAF, across air transportation supply chains, how to report and disclose those emissions reductions consistent with well-established existing accounting principles and frameworks. So again, in other words, pretty much what I'm saying here is the accounting information tells us the nuts and bolts, the numerical tracking of the emissions reductions benefits of SAF, that all important thing that we're transacting with the sale of and purchase rather of SAF environmental attributes. So a little more specifically, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I'll just say that the guideline addresses at least a half dozen specific greenhouse gas emissions reporting and disclosure topics. We explain the greenhouse gas protocol scopes of emissions as they relate to sustainable aviation fuel. We talk about life cycle emissions of fuels, and Kellen spent some time on this earlier today, explaining the critical importance of tracking the entire life cycle emissions of an energy source. So we discussed life cycle emissions for SAF and some of the unique aspects of biogenic SAF or biogenic fuels in general as it relates to life cycle emissions tracking. We then bring those two concepts together and discuss how to report life cycle emissions across the greenhouse gas protocol scopes. We spend some time building on the Global Logistics Emissions Council framework's guidance on greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, both external disclosures and internal disclosures between air transportation supply chain stakeholders, and explain in the context of SAF specifically what information needs to be exchanged between these entities and air transportation supply chains around the emissions intensity of SAF. We spend a lot of time on a really important concept, which is how to allocate the emissions reduction benefits of SAF across air transportation supply chains without erroneously double counting those emissions reductions benefits. And then finally, we provide some default emission factors for SAF that users of the guidelines can refer to when to get really a rough order of magnitude indication of the emissions intensity of different SAF production processes and feedstocks. And there are also numbers that users of the guidelines can refer to kind of ground truth and reality check the emissions intensity information that you may be getting from fuel producers when you're purchasing SAF or SAF environmental attributes. So that's accounting at the high level. Let's wrap this up here and summarize with what I believe is one of our last slides next. Thanks, Micah. So yes, to summarize, the guidelines that we've developed with MIT do a handful of things. We explain how to account for, allocate, and disclose the greenhouse gas emissions reductions benefits of SAF across air transportation supply chains. In doing that, we're really providing a foundation for air transportation supply chain entities to recoup some of the cost premium associated with the SAF emission reduction benefits. We're facilitating the spreading of the SAF cost premium across the air transportation supply chain. And with that cost premium spread, we expect the cost for any entity or group of entities in the supply chain to be lower, which means theoretically, they're going to be able to afford to purchase more SAF, increase the demand signal for SAF, help de-risk the investments in the production and distribution of SAF, and hopefully, incidentally, in doing that, to drive economies of scale for SAF production so SAF costs themselves come down. And the point of all of this being to facilitate the uptake and use of more SAF, and with SAF having a lower emission intensity than conventional aviation fuels, the ultimate aim is to reduce air transportation emissions on the whole. So with that, if we can jump to the next placeholder slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Alan to help moderate with the question and answer session.
Great, thank you, Dan. Could you just confirm that you're now able to hear me? So yeah, great. So we're not going to have the same issues at the start. Fantastic. Thanks to everybody who has submitted questions during the course of the presentation so far. I've been doing my best to keep up with them during the course of that. My typing isn't my strongest suit, so I hope any responses are legible, understandable, not too many typos. Within those questions, I think there are a couple of broader themes that I think we need to pick up on. One is the alignment between the approach that's been taken within our guidelines for the calculation methodology and broader greenhouse gas accounting guidance. Reference was made during the course of the presentation to specifically the GLEC framework as one of the inputs, but no, we have done our best to align with other accounting methodologies, including the greenhouse gas protocol, and indeed the GLEC framework does carry the built-on greenhouse gas protocol mark. So the aim has been to provide consistency with what already exists and is used, and then to expand that into this area, particularly of sustainable aviation fuels, and to identify where additional investment by effectively the customers of airlines can drive additional use of sustainable aviation fuels, both giving additional signals to the market that investment is worthwhile, and also to give benefit to the users of the sustainable aviation fuel and the airline services, that they can benefit in terms of emission reductions. And I can see that there's one comment about sort of how you can take into account SAF insets, and I provided a reply that basically said they count within your scope 3 footprint. And the question has come back about the relationship between insetting and offsetting. And I was wondering, Dan or Kellen, whether you wanted to pick up on that further at all.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually was just typing a response to a questioner who had admonished us not to make the mistake that planting trees constitutes a valid and verified voluntary carbon offset. So thank you for that clarification. Yes, my treatment of offsets earlier in the presentation was really just a general overview, and there is a whole body of knowledge around what are, quote, legitimate offsets and not. as for Alan's intervention about the relationship between an inset and an offset, really the key distinction is whether the key distinction between an inset and an offset as we define them is that the inset is related to, in some way, directly related to the actual source of the emissions that are being addressed. So to use my poor forestry example again, if we had a verified and validated high quality forestry project that was generating offsets that an air carrier bought into, that's wonderful in many respects. But that air carrier can buy as many offsets as they want, and they're not doing anything to actually reduce their own emissions footprint. And that's what's so critical about SAF interventions as an inset or other insets. And we're actually working on a broader work product that'll address insets across multimodal supply chains. That's coming later. The point of the inset is the insetting organization is addressing the actual source or something that has a close nexus to the actual source of emissions that they're generating. So with SAF as an insetting, as a mechanism to inset, an air carrier or a business traveler or a cargo shipper using air transportation services is making some contribution to reductions in the air transportation supply chain. And they're not just looking at addressing the emissions with a completely separate and though maybe valid and wonderful, but not related emissions reduction activity. So I hope that that addresses that question.
Thanks, Dan. If not, then I'm sure whoever asked it can pick up on it further with us in due course. The other issue which has been raised a lot in the questions is around the book and claim mechanisms. Our focus has been to really focus on the calculation methodology, and we do acknowledge that book and claim registry would be needed to underpin it. And most likely that book and claim registry may well be aligned with some form of blockchain functionality. There are various organizations that we know are thinking of or are developing ideas around book and claim, but that hasn't been our focus. And so I think we would want to steer clear of sort of waving a flag for one organization or another at this stage, knowing that there are various such initiatives under development. Again, Dan or Kellen, do you want to add anything to that?
None from mine. I think you covered it well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Al.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just looking at other topics, we also had one specifically around science-based targets initiative, which I did answer in the text, but I do want to emphasize that this has been developed in full sight of science-based targets initiative in parallel to them developing their aviation guidance, and that aviation guidance was recently soft launched. And when I say recently, we're in the last few days. They currently have a well below 2 degree trajectory as part of that guidance, and are currently looking to update that with a 1.5 degree trajectory, as I understand it. And once they've done that, then there'll probably be a more bells and whistles launch later in the year. But that SBTI guidance does directly reference our accounting guidance, and the idea is that they are compatible and the insets would be considered to be eligible within the SBTI calculations. There's also been one or two references to CORSIA, and again, you're probably getting the idea that we've tried to keep a lot of the sort of the main stakeholders in this area in touch with our work. We've engaged with CORSIA through conversations with the IATA representatives on CORSIA. So again, they're fully aware of this. We've made sure that we don't have any contradictions with what they have in terms of the SAF, the consideration of SAF or emission factors. We don't list all the versions of SAF in our guidance that they have in CORSIA, where we had maybe one or two queries about what might be considered to be a sustainable biofuel. Then we didn't include some lines within our list. But overall, there should be no conflict. And indeed, I believe certainly that IATA is supportive of what we're trying to do to drive further development of the SAF market, because they see SAF uptake also from an industry-wide perspective as a key way to meet CORSIA targets. I'm also aware that we're coming towards the very end of our hour, and we said at the start that we would wish to respect everybody's time. So at this stage, what I'd like to do is to hand back over to Micah to close out and make sure that we don't overstay our welcome. But I'd extend my thanks to Dan and to Kellen for the clear presentation of the guidelines. So Micah, over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks everybody for the questions. Yeah, so we've reached the end of our webinar, and we hope you have enjoyed it, and mostly we hope also that you got some more knowledge on sustainable aviation fuels. As mentioned at the start, this webinar was recorded, and I will share this recording with you in a few days' time. If you have any questions, either about the contents or anything else, please reach out via email to me, and I will make sure that the right person gets in touch with you. So yeah, thank you very much, and we wish you a pleasant day.